Page 447, Chapter 17, The Kids. The archipelago had many ugly mugs and many bared fangs. No matter what side you approached it from, there wasn't one you could admire. But perhaps the most abominable of all was that maw that swallowed up the kids. The kids were not at all the best prizorniki, or waifs, that's the thieves in training, in drab tatters, who scurried hither and thither, thieving and warming themselves at asphalt cauldrons on the streets, without whom one could not picture the urban life of the 20s. The waifs were taken from the streets, not from their families, into the colonies for juvenile delinquents. There was one attached to the People's Commissariat of Education as early as 1920. It would be interesting to know, too, how things went with juvenile offenders before the revolution, into workhouses for juveniles. The waifs were taken from the streets into the workhouses for juveniles and also into the labor communes of the OGPU from 1924 on. There was one attached to the Commissariat of Education as early as 1920. It would be interesting to know, too, how things went with juvenile offenders before the revolution, and the workhouse for juveniles, which existed from 1921 to 1930 and had bars, bolts, and jailers, so that in the outworn bourgeois terminology they could have been called prisons. Sorry, I butchered that. They had been orphaned by the Civil War, by its famine, by social disorganization, the execution of their parents, or the death of the latter at the front. And at that time, justice really did not try to return these children to the mainstream of life, removing them from their street apprenticeship as thieves. Factory apprenticeship began in the labor communes, and this was a privileged situation in the context of those years of unemployment, and many of the lads there learned with a will. From 1930 on, for sentenced juveniles, factory apprenticeship schools of a special type were created under the People's Commissariat of Education, of Justice. Right? The young offenders had to work from 4 to 6 hours a day, for which they received wages on the basis of the All-Union Code of Labor laws, and for the rest of their day they studied and played, and perhaps things might have been set to rights on this path. But where did the young offenders come from? They came from Article 12 of the Criminal Code of 1926, which permitted children from the age of 12 to be sentenced for theft, assault, mutilation, and murder. Article 58 offenses were also included under this heading, but they had been given moderate sentences, not the whole works like adults. Here was the first crawl hole into the archipelago for the future kids, but it was not yet a wide gate. We are not going to omit one interesting statistic. In 1927, prisoners aged 16, I didn't count the younger ones, to 24 represented 48% of all prisoners. What this amounts to is nearly half the entire archipelago in 1927 consisted of youths whom the October Revolution had caught between the ages of 6 and 14. 10 years after the victorious revolution, these same girls and boys turned up in prison and constituted half the prison population. This jives poorly with the struggle against the vestiges of bourgeois consciousness, which we inherited from the old society. But figures are figures. They demonstrate that the archipelago was never short of young people. But the question of how young was decided in 1935. In that year, the great evildoer once more left his thumbprint on history's submissive clay. Among such deeds as the destruction of Leningrad and the destruction of his own party. He did not overlook the children whom he loved so well, whose best friend he was, and with whom he therefore had his photograph taken, seeing no other way to bridle these insidious mischief-makers, those washerwomen's brats, who were overrunning the country in thicker and thicker swarms and growing more and more brazen in their violations of socialist legality. He invented a gift for them. These children from 12 years of age, by this time his beloved daughter was approaching that borderline, and could see that age he could see that age tangibly before his eyes, should be sentenced to the whole works in the code. In other words, with the application of all measures of punishment, as a decree of the Central Executive Committee and the Council of People's Commissars of April 7, 1935, elucidated, including that is capital punishment as well. Illiterates that we scrutinized decrees very little at the time. More and more we gazed at the portraits of Stalin with a black-haired little girl in his arms. Even less did the 12-year-olds read the decrees, and the decrees kept coming out one after another. On December 10, 1940, the sentencing of juveniles from the age 12 for putting various objects on railroad tracks. This was training young diversionists. On May 31st, 1941, it was decreed that for all the varieties of crime not included in Article 12, juveniles were to be given full sentences from the age of 14 on. But here, a small obstacle arose. The war of the fatherland began. But the law is a law, and on July 7, 1941, 4 days after Stalin's panicky speech, in the days when German tanks were driving toward Leningrad, Smolensk, and Kiev, one more decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet was issued, and it is difficult now to say in what respect it is more interesting for us today. In its unwavering academic character, showing what important questions were being decided by the government in those flaming days, or in its actual contents. The situation was that the prosecutor of the USSR, Vyshinsky, had complained to the Supreme Soviet about the Supreme Court, which meant His Graciousness had heard about the matter, because the courts were applying the decree of 1935 incorrectly, and these brats were being sentenced only when they had intentionally committed crimes. But this was impermissible softness, and so right in the heat of war, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet elucidated. This interpretation does not correspond to the text of the law. It introduces limitations not provided for by the law, and in agreement with the prosecutor, the Presidium issued a clarification to the Supreme Court. Children must be sentenced to the full measure of punishment applied, in other words, the whole works, even in cases where crimes committed were committed not intentionally, but as a result of carelessness. Now that is something, perhaps in all world history, no one has yet approached such a radical solution of the problem of children from 12 years on for carelessness, up to and including execution. And this is when all the escape holes were shut off to the greedy mice. That is when, finally, all the collective farm ears of grain were saved. And now the granaries were going to be filled to overflowing, and life would flourish, and children who had been bad from birth would be set on the long path of corruption. And none of the party prosecutors with children the same age shuddered. They found no problem in stamping the arrest warrants. And none of the party judges shuddered either. With bright eyes they sentenced little children to 3, 5, 8, and 10 years in general camps. And for shearing sheaves, these tykes got not less than 8 years. And for a pocketful of potatoes, one pocketful of potatoes in their child's trousers, they also got 8 years. Cucumbers did not have so high a value put on them, For a dozen cucumbers, Sarah Blocking got 5 years, and the hungry 14-year-old girl Lita and the Chingirlau district center of Kustanai province walked down the street, picking up, mixed with the dust, a narrow trail of grain spilled from a truck, doomed to go to waste in any case. For this she was sentenced to only 3 years because of the alleviating circumstances that she had not taken socialist property directly from the field or from the barn, and perhaps was also inclined the judges to be less harsh, was that in that same year of 1948 there had been a clarification of the Supreme Court to the effect that children need not be tried for theft, which had the character of childish mischief, but as a petty theft of apples in an orchard, such as. By analogy, the court drew the conclusion here that it was possible to be just a wee bit less harsh. But the conclusion we draw is that from 1935 to 1948, children were sentenced for taking apples, and a great many were sentenced for running away from factory apprenticeship training. True, they got only 6 months for that. In camp, they were jokingly called death row prisoners. But joke or no joke, here is a scene with some death row prisoners in a Far Eastern camp. They were assigned to dump the shit from latrines. There was a cart with 2 enormous wheels and an enormous barrel on it, full of stinking sludge. The death row prisoners were hitched up, with many of them in the shafts and others pushing from the sides and from behind. The barrel kept swaying and splashing on them, and the crimson-cheeked bitches in their twill suits roared with laughter as they urged the children on with clubs. And on the prisoner transport ship from Vladivostok to Sakhalin in 1949, the bitches used these children at knife point for carnal enjoyment. So even 6 months was sometimes enough too. And it was then that the 12-year-olds crossed the threshold of the adult prison cells, were equated with adults as citizens possessing full rights, equated by virtue of the most savage prison terms, equated in their whole unconscious life by bread rations, bowls of gruel, their places in the sleeping shells, and that is when that old term of communist re-education minors somehow lost its significance, when the outlines of its meaning faded, became unclear, and GULag itself gave birth to the ringing and impudent word kids. And with proud and bitter intonation, these bitter citizens began to use this term to describe themselves, not yet citizens of the country, but already citizens of the archipelago. So early and strangely did their adulthood begin, with a step across the prison threshold. And upon the 12 and 14-year-old heads burst a lifestyle that was too much for brave men who were experienced and mature. But the young people, by the laws of their young life, were not about to be flattened by this lifestyle, but instead grew into it and adapted to it. Just as new languages and new customs are learned without difficulty in childhood, so the juveniles adopted on the run both the language of the archipelago, which was that of the thieves, and the philosophy of the archipelago. And whose philosophy was that? From this life they took for themselves all its most inhuman essence, all its poisonous, rotten juice, and as readily as if it had been this liquid and not milk that they sucked from their mother's breasts in infancy. They grew into camp life so swiftly, not in weeks even, but in days, as if they were not in the least surprised by it, as if that life were not completely new to them, but a natural continuation of their free life of yesterday. Even out in freedom, they hadn't grown up in linens and velvets. It had not been the children of secure and powerful parents who had gone out to clip stalks of grain, filled their pockets with potatoes, been late at the factory gate, or run away from factory apprenticeship training. These kids were the children of workers. Out in freedom, they had understood very well that life was built upon injustice. But out there, things had not been laid out stark and bare to the last extremity. Some of it was dressed up in decent clothing, some of it softened by a mother's kind word. In the archipelago, the kids saw this world as it is seen by quadrupeds. Only might makes right. Only the beast of prey has the right to live. This is how we too in our adult years saw the archipelago, but we were capable of counterposing to it all our experience, our thoughts, our ideals, and everything that we had read to that very day. Children accepted the archipelago with the divine impressionability of childhood. And in a few days, children became beasts there, and the worst kind of beasts, with no ethical concepts whatever, looking into the calm, enormous eyes of a horse or caressing the flattened ears of a guilty dog. How can you deny that they have ethics? The kid masters the truth. If other teeth are weaker than your own, then tear a piece away from them. It belongs to you. There were two basic methods of maintaining kids in the archipelago in separate children's colonies, principally the younger kids not yet 15, and in mixed category camps, often with invalids and women, the senior kids. Both were equally successful in developing animal viciousness, and neither rescued the kids from being educated in the spirit of the thief's ideals. Take Yermolov. He reports that when he was only 12 years old in 1942, he saw a great deal of fraud, thievery, and speculation going on around him, and arrived at the following judgment about life. The only people who do not steal and deceive are those who are afraid to. As for me, I don't want to be afraid of anything, which means that I too will steal and deceive and live well. And yet, for a time, his life somehow developed differently. He became fascinated by the shining examples whose spirit he was taught in school. However, having got a taste of the beloved Father and laureates and ministers tell us that this was beyond their capacities. At the age of 14, he wrote a leaflet, "Down with Stalin, Hail Lenin." They caught him in that one, beat him up, gave him 5810 and imprisoned him with the kids and thieves. And Yermolov quickly mastered the thieves' law. The spirit of his existence spiraled upwards deeply, and at the age of 14 he executed his negation of a negation. He had returned to the concept of thievery as the highest and best of all existence. And when did he see the children's colony? There was even more injustice than in freedom. The chiefs and the jailers lived off the state, shielded by the correctional system. Part of the kids' ration went to the kitchen into the bellies of the instructors. The kids were beaten with boots, kept in fear so that they would be silent and obedient. Here it is necessary to explain that the ration of the youngest juveniles was not the ordinary camp ration. Though it sentenced kids to long terms of imprisonment, the government did not cease to be humane. It did not forget that these same children were the future masters of communism. Therefore, they added milk and butter and real meat to their rations. So how could the instructors resist the temptation of dipping their ladle into the kids' pot? And how could they compel the kids to be silent, except by beating them with boots? Perhaps one of these kids who grew up in this way will someday relate a story more dismal than Oliver Twist. The simplest reply to the overpowering injustices was to create injustices oneself. This was the easiest conclusion, and it would now become the rule of life of the kids, and for a long time to come, or even forever. But here's what's interesting. In giving the cruel world battle, the kids didn't battle against one another. They didn't look on each other as enemies. They entered this struggle as a collective, a united group. Was this a budding socialism? The indoctrination of the instructors? Oh, come on. Cut the cackle, big mouths. This is a descent into the law of thieves. After all, the thieves are united. After all, the thieves have their own discipline and their own ringleaders. And the juveniles were the apprentices of the thieves. They were mastering the precepts of their elders. Oh, of course, they were intensely indoctrinated. Their instructors came with 3 stars, 4 stars on their shoulder boards, and read them lectures on the Great War of the Fatherland, on the immortal fear of our people, on the fascist atrocities, on the sunny Stalinist concern for children, on what a Soviet person should be. But the great teaching on society, built on economics alone, knowing nothing about psychology, is ignorant even on that simple psychological law which says that the repetition of anything 5 and 6 times already arouses disbelief, or even more than that, nausea. The kids were disgusted by whatever had been earlier rammed down their throats by their teachers, and now by instructors who simultaneously stole from the kitchen. And even the patriotic speech of an officer from a military unit, "Boys, you have been entrusted with the task of dismantling parachutes. This is valuable silk, the motherland's property. Try to take care of it," had no success. Rushing for over-fulfillment of the norms and to get extra dishes of cereal, the kids at Krivoshenkova cut up all the silk into useless scraps, and out of all the seeds sown among them, they took over only the seeds of hate, of hostility to the 58th, and a feeling of superiority over the enemies of the people. This was something that would come in handy later on, in the general camps. For the time being, however, there were no enemies of the people among them. Yura Yermolov was just the same kind of typical kid. He had long since exchanged the stupid political law for the wise thief's law. No one could avoid being crooked up in that mash. No boy could remain a separate individual. He would be trampled, torn apart, ostracized if he did not immediately declare himself a thief's apprentice. And all of them took that inevitable oath. Reader, put your own children in their place. Who was the enemy of the kids in the children's colonies? The jailers and the instructors. The struggle was against them. The kids knew their strength very well. The first element of their strength was unity, and the second, impunity. It was only on the outside that they had been driven into here on the basis of the law for adults. But once in here, in the archipelago, they were under the protection of a sacred taboo. "Milk, chief, give us our milk." They would howl and beat the door of the cell and break up their bunks and break all the glass in sight, all of which would have been termed armed rebellion or economic sabotage among adults. They had nothing to fear. Their milk would be brought them right away. Or, say they were marching a column of kids under armed guard through a city, and it seems so even shameful to guard children so strictly. Far from it, they had worked out a plan, a whistle, and all who wanted to scattered in different directions. And what were the guards to do? Shoot at whom? At children? And so their prison terms came to an end in one fell swoop. 150 years ran away from the state. You don't enjoy looking silly, then don't arrest children. Our future novelist, the one who spent his childhood among the kids, will describe to us a multitude of kids' tricks, how they ran riot in the colonies, how they got back at and played nasty tricks on their instructors, despite the seeming severity of the terms meted out to them. and the camp regimen, the kids developed great insolence out of impunity. Here is one of their boastful stories about themselves, which, knowing the typical pattern of the kids' actions, I fully believe. Some excited and frightened children ran up to the nurse of a children's colony and summoned her to help one of their comrades who was seriously ill. Forgetting caution, she quickly accompanied them to their big cell for 40. As soon as she was inside, the whole anthill went into action. Some of them barricaded the door and kept watch. Dozens of hands tore everything off her, all the clothes she had on, and toppled her over, and then some sat on her hands and legs, and then everyone doing what he could and where. They raped her, they kissed her, they bit her. It was against orders to shoot them, and no one could rescue her until they themselves let her go, profaned and weeping. In general, of course, interest in the female body begins early by some boys, and in the kids' cell it was intensely heated up by colorful stories and boasting. And they never let a chance go by to let steam off. Here is an episode. In broad daylight, in full view of everyone, 4 kids were sitting in the compound of Krivosikovo, Camp Number 1, talking with a girl called Lubia from the bookbinding shop. She retorted sharply that something they had said. The boys leaped up, grabbed her legs, lifted them in the air. She was in a defenseless position while she supported herself around on the ground with her hands. Her skirt fell over her head. The boys held her that way and pressed her with their free hands. And then they let her down, not roughly either. Did she slap them? Did she run away from them? Not at all. She sat down just as before and continued the argument. These were 16-year-old kids, and it was an adult camp with mixed categories. It was the same one that had the women's barracks for 500, where all the copulation took place without curtains, and which the kids used to enter importantly like men. In the children's colonies, if the kids worked for 4 hours and then were supposed to be in school for 4, but all that schooling was fake. When transferred to an adult camp, they had a 10-hour working day, except that their work norms were reduced, while their ration norms were the same as adults. They were transferred at the age of 16, but their undernourishment and improper development in camp and before camp endowed them at that age with the appearance of small, frail children. Their height was stunted, their minds and their interests, as were their minds and their interests. They were sometimes maintained in separate brigades depending on the kind of work they were doing, and sometimes they were mixed into a general brigade with elderly invalids. Here too, reduced physical labor was required of them, or simply native child labor. After the children's colony, their situation changed drastically. No longer did they get the children's ration, which so tempted the jailers, and therefore the latter ceased to be their principal enemy. Some old men appeared in their lives on whom they could try their strength. Women appeared on whom they could try their maturity. Some real live thieves appeared, fat-faced camp stormtroopers who willingly undertook their guidance, both in world outlook and in training in thievery. To learn from them was tempting, and not to learn from them was impossible. For a free reader, does the word thief perhaps sound like a reproach? In that case, he has understood nothing. This word is pronounced in the underworld in the same way that the word knight was pronounced among the nobility, and even with greater esteem, and not so loudly, but softly, like a sacred word. To be a worthy thief someday was a kid's dream. This was the elemental motivating force of their companionship, yes, even for the most independent among them. For a young man pondering life, there was no destiny more reliable. take a break there. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.